Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Allen. Supply chain. These are two words which most of us probably never thought about prior to COVID. But along with a host of other issues, the era of COVID has both created and exposed problems with supply chain. Perhaps you have seen the photos of massive barges containing shipping containers just sitting a few miles from port for weeks and weeks on end, waiting to be unloaded. And these containers aren't carrying just toys and frivolous goods. Recent reports state that between 8,000 and 12,000 shipping containers carrying medical supplies to various parts of the U.S. are on a delay of up to 37 days due to ongoing transportation delays and backlogs. Supply chain issues are also impacting car sales. Have you driven by a car lot lately, noticed how few cars are available for sale? And how much more a used car is now selling for because of that? Much of this is due to semiconductor chip shortages and delays. And think of the impact the BC flooding had on shipping goods to Canada and within Canada. With roads washed away and bridges out, a lot of the lower mainland transportation simply ground to a halt. So how do we solve the supply chain problem? Is Canada making any progress domestically to solve this potentially international problem? How is inflation impacting? Should we be producing more within our own borders? Should we be reshoring? And if we do reshore, how will this impact our international relationships and your wallet? Well, joining me later in the program to discuss reshoring is the Honourable Tony Clement, former Minister of Industry, co-founder of Reshoring Canada and host of Boom and Bust right here on our network. But now to share his expertise, we are joined by Johnny Rungtusanatham, Canadian Research Chair in Supply Chain Management and Professor of Operations Management and Information Systems at the Schulich School of Business. Professor Rungtusanatham, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Appreciate it. So for our viewers, some people really just have no familiarity or their industry or their work does not engage in a supply chain. So what is a supply chain?
So I'm going to define this from the consumer, the average consumer perspective. We walk in a store and we buy a product, for example, my cell phone, right? Now, we normally don't think about what are all the different players, parts, people, companies involved in actually getting this phone to be available for me to purchase at a store. But when you think about the product itself, there are probably many, many different companies, many different manufacturing entities, transportation companies that actually help us move parts, materials, components, systems, and to a point where it gets assembled and then ultimately delivered to the store where I am able to buy the product physically or to an online store where I can order the product. So when we talk about supply chain, it is the network of players, transportation companies, manufacturing companies that all work hopefully in a synchronized manner to create that product that I am able to find in the store.
Okay, and what is the current state of the supply chain? Of course, we've seen with various industries, they've been so deeply impacted. Yes, we've all seen those images of those ships outside, those cargo ships just outside of Los Angeles port waiting to be unloaded. What is the current state?
So everything that we buy has a supply chain. The issue is whether it's a very long supply chain or a very short. Something could be made just next door to me, right? And that's the supply chain. It's just a very short supply chain. Well, because we trade globally, and I talk about Canada, okay, our supply chains are very long. In the past 20 years, we've also been on a push for efficiency, which means that we look for ways to reduce costs. And oftentimes that means reducing, surplus capacity or reducing, surplus inventory, what we call safety stock. And so supply chains have been stretched, okay? And COVID-19 really just exposed the fragility of the supply chains that even before COVID-19 was under stress.
So it was already under stress. So with COVID, what are we seeing? We have about 30 seconds before commercial. What kind of impacts are we seeing, say, because of COVID?
Unavailability of components, parts, semiconductor chip, and
Right.
you saw that. People not being able to work means that we're not able to produce as much as we normally would. And so we're seeing delays, right? In terms of goods being made available at specific points in that network to allow us to produce as planned.
Right. And of course, as I mentioned in my opener, one that's very apparent is with these microchips that are so inexpensive, really, but how some small part like that have really caused such tremendous delay. We'll pick up this discussion in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're unpacking the supply chain crisis. That's a global situation, but obviously here in Canada, we are feeling it very, very much. And joining me for that discussion is Johnny Rungtusanatham. Thank you so much, Johnny, for joining me again today. So one overarching question that at least strikes me and perhaps some of our viewers is, when did the world become so interconnected? When did we develop this reliance on supply chain? Is this something that just kind of developed organically, or is it something that's been more of a phenomenon in the last 20, 30 years?
We've always had global supply chains, right? Back in the day, even colonial days when we were trading, we had supply chains. We just never thought about them in the manner that we now understand today. And so back to the days when we were bartering to now when we're trading, we have supply chains. So it's not a new phenomenon. And one key point I want to make is that the delays and interruptions that we experience today have always been there. Okay, it's just that it's become more prominent because now we're all feeling the pain of long global stretched supply chains and products and goods not being available in the quantities that we expect them to be in the normal situation.
So we've always, in some ways, had these, as you mentioned, these long supply chains, or we've had supply chains long, short. They've always been there. So that's a very wonderful way of explaining it to us. But with the supply chain disruptions, you've said that they've always been there, but with COVID, there's sort of a light has been shone on them. A greater focus has been paid. More attention has been paid. What kind of disruptions would we have seen pre-COVID that might make us remember, oh, right, I remember that. And yeah, that was a supply chain crisis issue?
There are small events that trigger shortages. For example, if a manufacturing plant experiences fire, that means that they cannot make certain things that will then be shipped. I mean, we saw the fire in Texas, and then phone companies, not one of which is no longer in existence. We had the volcano eruptions, with earthquakes, with natural disasters. So you can think about any event which basically stops the flow of good as a disruption. Okay, and the question becomes one of how massive is that interruption, and how quickly can we recover? Some supply chains have buffers in place, and so as consumers, we're not impacted because those buffers allow companies in the network to actually recover, and so we don't feel the pain. COVID-19 just made everybody sort of feel the pain, which is why it's shown such a bright light on supply chains today.
No, absolutely. And I'm glad to hear that some supply chains have those buffers in place. I guess when we were experiencing all of this during COVID, I'm thinking, well, why weren't there more buffers or stronger buffers? Because it seems, for example, let's talk about British Columbia, right? They had a natural disaster, a natural event, extreme flooding, which washed out roads. And again, I mean, obviously that's a crisis situation, not common in every generation. But would there not have been buffers for that kind of situation? Why don't people pre-plan for something like that?
Well, it's hard to pre-plan for a natural event which shuts down roads and modes of transportation, right? Now, you also couple that with the Port of Vancouver, which in the supply chain terminology, that's what we call a very critical node. If you think about goods flowing to Canada, on the West Coast, Port of Vancouver is the busiest, the largest. And so if everything coming into Canada through the Port of Vancouver stop, right? And stop meaning that goods cannot be moved out of the port, which means that goods cannot be moved into the port. And so you basically have a stoppage point. It's almost like you look at a pipe of water and you just broke the pipe, right? And now everything's sort of like pulling around that breakage point, so.
Wow. Okay. And how competent are we to maneuver and adapt? I know we talked about these buffers, but are we flexible in Canada, both as a consumer and as a manufacturer? Are people kind of waking up and now saying, okay, we need to kind of figure out workarounds if something like this happens again with, say, flooding, with COVID, something like that?
Well, A lot of companies actually do risk planning, okay? But what I've seen, okay, is that sometimes our risk planning just sits on the shelves, and we don't go into, practice mode. Okay, we don't practice. What happens if the catastrophe hits us? What happens if our people get all come down with illness? We don't practice that. I remember back when I was in Thailand. We do earthquake drills, right? Or we
right.
do. So we're not into that scenario, but I hope we can do more, because it's good to plan, but sometimes you also need to practice the plan, right?
That's right.
In armed services, we do military drills, and that's what I think we might want to see more of in the private sector.
Welcome back. We're discussing the supply chain crisis and what's being done about it. How have we as Canadians been able to pivot, to maneuver, to become more resilient to a problem when we have an issue with our supply chain? And joining me again is Johnny Rungtusanatham. Thank you again for joining me. So what is Canada doing? What should our government be doing to help us become more resilient when we do have supply chain issues? What are we doing to prevent them? What are we doing to become more competent at and being more resilient when we do have those kinds of issues?
So the government can only, look into infrastructure and making sure that the infrastructure is robust. Okay? The government is also investing quite a bit into digital transformation, right? Where you have artificial intelligence. And what these technologies and capabilities do is allow us to actually monitor faster and hopefully detect faster. Because we know when it comes to supply chain disruptions, the faster you detect something going wrong, the faster you can mobilize. And in many ways, I congratulate BC for how quickly they were able to come together, private, public, to actually deal with the situation. First and foremost, because they realize the Port of Vancouver is so important. You can't have the Port of Vancouver be cut off for a whole month. Then we're in serious trouble, right?
Absolutely.
So the government is doing what it can, but some of these initiatives in the long run will need private-public sort of partnerships, right? And this is where incentivizing investments in Canada to make certain goods, critical products, would be important to continue to make Canada not completely self-sufficient, because we'll never get to the point where we don't trade.
Right.
Okay? But at least give us a little bit, slack in terms of allowing us time to react when situations do arise.
Yeah, and I think for most Canadians, certainly there are some goods that we can forego, but and I don't generally want to encourage the government interfering in private enterprise. Usually, supply and demand will just solve those problems naturally, and that's a good thing. But when we're dealing with food, gas, where we saw quickly in British Columbia how quickly there were rations put on these products because of the critical and emergency situation, it makes us wonder, well, how resilient are we? So I am pleased to hear that the government is kind of taking notice, and doing something about it. But me as a person, as an individual, not working in government, not working in manufacture, what do I need to do to become more resilient as a consumer?
I would say, number one, we need to be patient, blaming one another, blaming retailers, blaming companies, blaming the government isn't going to solve the problem. Two, we need to sort of look at our own, consumption pattern and figure out, how much are we join the consumerism, bandwagon and just buying without thinking about whether something's necessary. We need to not engage in hoarding out of fear, right? The good news is that we have goods, okay? It's just that they may not be getting to where they need to go quick enough, right? So it's not like we're running out of resources and therefore we're all going to be starving or we're going to have no amenities. It's just going to take a little more time. And hence the patience.
But sometimes we have components that we require. For example, the semiconductor chips. A large majority, correct me if I'm wrong, were produced and manufactured in China. China, we have a very delicate relationship. Can we call it that? We could talk about, obviously, the issues with communism. We could talk about the two Michaels, the human rights issues. How will our reshoring of certain things impact those kinds of relationships? How dependent should we be on a country like China to produce such clearly an essential item that we need, that we can't even produce a car without these chips?
So unless the government is willing to build a fab inside Canada, it's a very, very expensive proposition. It's not just the amount of money that you put into it, but you also have to consider the environmental issues.
Right.
And so there's, it's not a simple question of like, let's just do that in Canada.
Right.
And so in the long run, we may still need to consider not only the trade economic angle, but also the political angle. It will be naive of me to advise the government as it relates to the relationship with China. I tend to be realistic. If we can all just coexist and understand how we work, to help the world become better, then perhaps we can work around some of these issues.
Right, exactly. If we can make it a win-win, then we'll be all right. My concern is will we come to a point where we have a nation that's holding up a supply chain for political reasons? And is that something that we can foresee in the future? Have we already seen that in certain parts of the world? Yes,
we saw that in the early parts of the COVID response, right, where, the PPE, was actually on hold. And so, it was good that the Canadian government actually mobilized and tried to get Canadian manufacturers to pivot.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate all of your insights on supply chain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll be right back. Welcome back. And now to discuss reshoring and how that could solve perhaps some of our supply chain issues is the Honourable Tony Clement, former Minister of Industry and co-founder of Reshoring Canada and the host of Boom and Bust right here on our network. Tony, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, for sure.
So please share with our viewers, what exactly is reshoring?
Well, reshoring is the idea of getting back at least part of our supply chain back to local manufacturing in Canada. And the idea about Reshoring Canada is that we want to have what we call resilient supply chains for Canada. And that means making sure that our supply chains support our national security, they support our health security, and they support our job security. So it doesn't mean manufacturing everything in Canada, that would be unrealistic, but It does mean certain aspects of our supply chain really should be back in Canada.
Right. And, as I mentioned in my opener, presently between 8,000 to 12,000 shipping containers carrying medical supplies are delayed being distributed to the U.S. for up to 37 days because of ongoing transportation backlogs. So when you mentioned medical, okay, that's clearly one. What other areas of even manufacturing ought Canada focus on, or ought we be reshoring?
Well, we have various levels of supply chain crisis going on right now. Part of it has to do with semiconductor chips. That's a very good example because they go into manufacturing our automobiles, and there's been a massive slowdown of that. In Canada and the U.S., it means, sort of our high-end defense systems need semiconductor chips. Everything needs semiconductor chips.
Right.
And because of this supply chain disruption, there's been a lot of efforts now to look at ways to have semiconductor chips not necessarily being built all in Asia. Another example is what we call critical minerals, Tanya. Those are things like lithium and other things where they go into electric vehicle batteries. They go into high-end goods that we take for granted, like smartphones. And yet, the People's Republic of China has about 75% of that market. So these are all things now that are being contemplated. Is there a better way to build a better supply chain that is to our national security as well as to jobs and health security as well?
Well, I asked this to my previous guest, and you having the insight of being a former federal government minister, you could probably really tackle this. How does one go and reshore something, say, for example, like semiconductor chips, politically? Would China perceive the reshoring of something like that as a threat against them, as a strike against them? How do you navigate those political waters?
Well, I think basically what's happening is the rest of the world is saying, gee, do we want China to control major amounts of the supply chain, especially in strategic areas? And the answer from our European allies, from President Biden in the United States, from Australia, has been no, we want to create our own supply chains that are much more secure. So the fact of the matter is China is relying less and less on external trade. They actually have a 5-year plan, the Communist Party does, to rely on their own domestic markets to create growth in China in the future. So it's called decoupling. There's a lot of decoupling in the supply chain that's already going on, even without COVID.
Right. Okay, I understand. And what obstacles do you foresee in some of these manufacturers or some of these companies who are trying to reshore? And I want to talk about your company in just a moment. We only have a minute left.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the big thing is they got to assess the cost. But I would argue, and we are arguing Reshoring Canada, that when you actually look at the true costs of manufacturing overseas, shipping, and as you say, these containers lying around the ports for many weeks on end, it's actually cheaper nowadays to manufacture locally. And especially with environmental and social and governance goals kicking in as they are in our society, even more of an argument to produce locally and at a cost that is bearable.
Okay, and what does your organization, Reshoring Canada, do? And if there's viewers who want help in reshoring, where should they go?
Yeah, visit reshoringcanada.ca, and we're a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization that looks at creating more information and more advocacy for reshoring, both amongst government officials and also businesses as well. Okay,
Tony, thank you so much for joining me today.
For sure.
Well, the COVID crisis has clearly identified another area where we can improve upon: supply chain. And if we can take this negative and turn it into a positive with reshoring, that would be a win for Canada. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.